This is the Firekeepers, a series within the Wired Ape where we sit down with the people doing the work that modern culture keeps trying to forget it needs. Long-form conversation with practitioners, like our current guest, who have given their lives to ritual, ceremony, passage, grief, and the kinds of transitions that institutions don't know how to hold. This episode is about one of those practitioners and about the organization he leads, which is doing something that is genuinely rare. It's building the infrastructure. Mikey Ellis is the CEO of Rites of Passage Institute, based in Australia. ROPI was founded over 30 years ago with one stated aim: to bring rites of passage back into the mainstream. That project has now touched more than 350,000 people in over 20 countries, embedded programs in more than 50 Australian schools, and worked with Bachelor elders to restore ceremonies on Bachelor land that haven't been practiced in over 200 years. Mikey leads all of that. He also separately runs his own men's circles and coaching practice, working with men in midlife who feel what he describes as the ache of something deeper. Now, what I find most compelling about Mikey is that he holds two scales at once. The institutional scale: what does a whole school, a whole community, a whole culture need? And the intimate scale: what does one man sitting across the room from you in a circle need right now, tonight, when the questions he can't stop asking is this all there is? Those two questions usually happen in different rooms, but today they're happening in the same one. This episode is about rites of passage, what they are, why modern culture stopped providing them, and what it costs us, individually and collectively, when the moment of becoming goes unmarked. So, Mikey, what first struck with me is this framing you use for your own practice: not leadership development or men's well-being, but courageous conversations. You define them as starting with a nervous, wildly beating heart that can no longer be ignored. So I've been thinking about that, because what you're describing is not a conversation that's productive or efficient. It's a conversation that's necessary, and that's a different thing. And I think that distinction runs through everything ROPI does. The other thing I keep coming back to is that you describe your work with men in midlife as guiding people toward the sacred path of who they were meant to become. Now, that's a spiritual claim, a genuinely spiritual claim, wrapped up inside what could easily be sold as coaching or leadership development. And I think it takes a particular kind of courage to say that out loud in the context you're operating in: schools, organizations, a culture that doesn't always have language for the sacred. So let's start at the beginning. Before we get into the work, I want to know about you a little bit. What were you like before any of this? Before ROPI, before men's circles, before you started asking the questions that led you here?
What was I like? Curious. I guess as a kid, I was always just really curious, and I just asked a lot of questions. I think, like most kids, I was just really interested in what was happening around me, and I was interested in what was happening within me and what was happening around in the context of the relationships I was having with other people. And yeah, I just was really interested in life and in everything. I was a really curious kid, and then, during my school and teenage years, that led to me studying, philosophy and English language and communication. I was just always really interested in what we're doing here and how it all works. So I guess that's probably the best way to describe what I was like before, and still am now. But really, that's kind of I think that's how I look back at those.
So was there a moment, like a crossing of some kind, when you knew your life was going in a different direction? Something where the old version of you ended and something new began?
There's been lots of those times, and I keep thinking that whenever those times are happening, then this is it. This is the time when this is the thing that changes everything, when it's all going to be different. But I think looking back, there hasn't been one moment, there hasn't been one time. There's been a series of events that have really kind of helped or facilitated growth. And there's been a lot of events. There's been a lot of times that have been significant in my life, I would say.
Well, in Japanese Zen practice, there's a concept called shoshin, or beginner's mind, where the deepest learning comes from letting go of what you think you already know. Was there a moment in this work where you had to unlearn something you thought you understood about men, about passage, about what transformation this actually requires?
Yeah, I think that's a constant unlearning, to be honest. I've always sought to understand, and I've done a lot of learning, and I've done a lot of study, and I've thought, and I believe that I've known what I've known what I'm doing, but there's a difference between having knowledge and that being a lived experience and embodied wisdom. There's a big difference. And so, yeah, I think a lot of more recently, there's been a lot of unlearning or redefining what it is that I think I know, and having some humility, some more humility at least around what it is that I know. And I think this is what happens throughout life as you sort of get older. The more I look back, at least on myself as a teenager and in my 20s and 30s, I thought I knew everything, and I had lots of knowledge, but I didn't have a lot of embodied experience, integrated experience. There was knowledge and then there was experience, but there wasn't a lot of the integration piece of weaving those two together was something that takes time. And I think that's something that is still, and only really just beginning to happen in a genuine way. So yeah, constant unlearning and constant humbling, and which in itself is a learning. So yeah, I'm grateful for that.
So, if you had to name the moment this work became undeniably yours, what would that be?
Not something I was learning, but something I was living. There's not a moment where that happened. There's not a moment. As I said, it's an ongoing evolution. It's an ongoing process. And I think an awareness of how important that embodiment piece is part of what I'm learning now. It's not something that happened. It's something that I'm in the process of experiencing still, and in different stages, and there's things that I've learned and have embodied to this point, but they're not done. And it certainly wasn't one thing. And there's just a constant ongoing evolution of those experiences of becoming different versions of myself, different versions of different levels of awareness and understanding and embodiment. So there's a lot of shedding of old stories and old parts, and then there's a lot of embracing sort of new versions, and that's an ongoing practice, I think, for me at least.
Now, when someone asks you what a rite of passage is, what do you say? Not the definition, but the thing that you truly want them to actually understand.
What do I want them to understand? I think the first thing about this is that we all go through stages of growth and change and development. And it can be as simple as that it is a process of change, and it happens for all of us at different times. So it's not something specific or unique or something that happens in isolation. It's a process that we all go through. And I think understanding what some of those processes are, such as, becoming a young adult, as we develop, as a child develops through adolescence into adulthood, that those are stages of development. There are significant life events that happen that potentially, that are a rite of passage, and how well they're or otherwise supported, will largely determine how that experience of growth through that passage, through that time is experienced. Getting married, getting divorced, having children if you have children, moving out into Europe, moving out of the home, or traveling to a different country, or sickness and injuries. Those sorts of things are all potentially rites of passage. And so, yeah, I think just helping people understand that we all go through different stages of change.
So, what does a ROPI program actually look like from the inside? If I were a young man at one of your camps, what would that experience be?
Unfamiliar, probably, to start with. There's three key stages to a rites of passage experience, and the first one is separation from the known and the familiar, and being immersed or introduced into a container, a space, an environment that's unfamiliar, that's different. This isn't normal and usual. So we have a property where the camps run, and so this is an unfamiliar environment. It's not home. It's not school. It's a different place. And so that's probably the first thing that boys and young men and the men that attend are Making Amends, for example, in that program. The first thing is that there's a marked separation from regular life, and we walk into the property, and there's a separation from where we were in the car, on the way to the venue, in the at home, or wherever it is that you're coming from that might be familiar. This is a different place, and this is a place where where really, really important work happens. And so the first thing you probably notice is that it's a little unfamiliar because it's new. And then I think the next thing that people experience is, which sounds a bit paradoxical, but it's a familiarity. It's like, oh, this isn't home. This isn't what I know, but there's also a sense of a shared experience that I notice and that I feel, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. It might be an unfamiliar place, but there's a sense of belonging that often, happens, that we cultivate through shared experiences, through shared stories, through a sense of connection. So, I guess there's that sort of contrast of unfamiliarity and also something that feels quite deeply connected and grounding, a sense of belonging, that in and of itself might feel unfamiliar because it's not something a lot of people have experienced in that way before. So I guess there's a couple of things I would say you could expect.
So, in many traditional West African healing contexts, the role of the elder or healer is described as holding the container, which is creating the conditions for something to happen rather than making it happen. Is that close to how you experience your role as a facilitator, or does it work differently for you?
No, it's the same. It doesn't work differently. I think that is accurate. There's I think the role of any facilitator is to create the conditions in which change can happen, and to support and to proactively enable and support those conditions. It's certainly not to do the work for anybody, but there is a responsibility to create and to maintain the conditions within which that can happen. And I think, on a camp or any sort of rite of passage experience, there are different roles that different people play, and the role you mentioned of an elder is a very important one. And a lot of that is an embodied presence that can be attuned to, experience and a role for a facilitator to play, and also for elders.
There's a framework from Belgian anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, who spent decades documenting transition rituals across cultures in the early 1900s, and he found they all follow the same three-part structure pretty much: separation, the threshold, and then return. It seems like that. Does that match up to what you actually do? And if so, what stage do you find modern culture is most poorly equipped to support?
Yeah. I mean, it's an archetypal framework, and so yes, it's certainly how it's a framework within which we work, and I think that one of the challenges of this work is that it happens that it's not common, and so the integration of this, or the return, coming back into the community, having experienced something, like a change, or having experienced a change, coming back into the community, back home, back to your family, or back to work, or back to what's familiar, how unprepared they are in order to welcome the return of anybody who's been through a change. And that can be quite a clunky sort of re-entry and a bit of an anticlimax for a lot of people. It certainly has been my experience whenever I've gone and done something where I've, whether it's been a retreat or traveling, or done something significant, you return home. It's like nothing really has. Nothing's changed here. I've changed a fair bit, but yeah, you sort of it's that re-entry back into what's familiar and known can be hard. And I think that's probably that integration piece is where we don't do that as well as a culture as we could.
Your work spans enormous scale: 350,000 people, schools, programs across 20 countries, and also the most intimate scale too: one man, one circle, and one conversation. How do you carry both of those at once, and do they inform each other in any way?
Yep. They're two contexts. There's the one, the individual, and the collective. They don't exist in isolation. They coexist, those two contexts. And yes, they do inform each other. I mean, you can only ever work. I mean, yeah, we can work with groups, and we do work with groups. We can work with, but it's at the same time, it's personal. And a lot of the work, and a lot of the conversations, a lot of the work is one-on-one, and so we do both. I mean, I do both. We're having a one-on-one conversation here, but also it's in the context of people listening as well. So I think it's just holding those two contexts at the same time. it's not that they can coexist. I mean, they do coexist, and so it's just for me, it's a case of, which context am I in, and what's my role here, and so how can I be present to that, and of service to that. And sometimes it's, to a group, and other times it's, it's to a conversation.
So, who shows up with this? Not the demographic, but what they're carrying when they walk through the door. What do you typically find they're carrying when they start one of these programs?
Rites of Passage framework training. We've run a camp for young people, age 7 to 11, and one of their parents. So each one of those groups of people are going to show up with something quite different, and each one of those individuals is going to show up with something quite different. I think what they're all showing up with is a desire to understand, what they can do to support themselves and the ones that they love through these transitions of it might be a mother or a father or a caregiver wanting to support a young person through, a stage of development as they, as they grow into, from a child through adolescence. There's a lot that's required, in order to support somebody through that. So often the kids show up, thinking it's an adventure, going to go camping and have a great time with, with their mum or dad or someone important in their lives. I think that's a pretty common hope or common experience that people show up with.
So, what does transformation actually look like at the end of one of your programs? Not a feeling or a testimonial, but what does the person do differently?
Everybody. What we hear a lot is that the relationships that they have with the people that they love, whether that be their partners or their kids or their colleagues, how they show up in those relationships changes as a result of this work. There's a lot more, often what we hear is there's a lot more sense of appreciation, gratitude, compassion, a desire to connect more honestly, more authentically, more intimately from a, vulnerability perspective. There's a more shared experience of some of the challenges that we all face as humans growing through different stages of life. It's coming back to a more deeply human experience of of connection and love and how we might live and relate from that place.
So, as you know, rites of passages in this day and age are not exactly common. Why would you say a rite of passage is not optional? Why isn't good parenting, a good education, or a good therapy enough?
Because I don't think education or parenting or therapy exists in isolation. They're all essential. I think, if a rite of passage experience is a is a is an acknowledgement and an integration of all of those things. It doesn't happen in isolation, or what happens in a rite of passage experience should incorporate the context in which, people are showing up, the familial context, the environmental context, the cultural context. And it involves elements of all of those things. It involves elements of parenting or therapy without calling it therapy. It's an opportunity to share some stories, and it's an opportunity to learn about your role, your changing role in relationship to others. It's a context in which all of that happens, and it's a context which should, because people bring their context with them. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to meet everybody where they are. Because some people are parents. Some people, really wanting to understand themselves and their role and what they do more, and then to understand themselves, better. So there's elements of all of those things in the work that we do, because, we're talking about and we're working with people, who are going through changes. So yeah, I think it incorporates all of those roles and elements, and necessarily so I think it does that as well.
So, the modern world tends to think of transitions as things you manage, you get through them, you adapt, and then you cope. What's the frame that's missing from that way of thinking?
Pathologize change as a problem to solve, and I think that change and growth and evolution through different stages of life is necessarily challenging.
Right.
It can be hard, and it can be, an incredible, joyful and experience of relief and hope and aspiration, but it's something that we can learn and grow through.
Mm, absolutely, yeah. So I heard of a reference to the Mescalero Apache sunrise ceremony for girls, which the United States government bans in 1883 as dangerously heathenish. But since it's been restored, there have been accounts of improved well-being across those communities. So what does this story tell you about what these ceremonies are actually doing?
Well, what is this? I don't know. I can't comment specifically on that because it's not a tradition or an experience that I'm familiar with. However, what I will say is that, these experiences are culturally specific. There is a there's a universal archetype of how a rite of passage will likely play out through those three stages that we mentioned, but the specifics are culturally the details are culturally specific. And if a government in the 1800s was banning something, it's probably because there was a complete, there was a misunderstanding of the cultural context in which this was happening. And I think that's something we need to be aware of is the context in which we operating. And so what that looks like is going to be different. What I imagine would be different is that we are more connected through these experiences, that we each have a role to play in these stages of growth and change and development, and these stages of transformation that we all go through, that we all have a role to play and we know what that is, and that we're able to support each other through that. I think that would be, and we're able to contribute what it is that we've learned and experienced through our own experiences in a way that's, that contributes to others, and in a way that contributes to the well-being of the community. I think that'd be a pretty good outcome.
What's the most common misunderstanding about what you do? The thing that makes you want to slow down and kind of start the conversation over again?
What's the most common misunderstanding? That it's, I think potentially, I'm hesitant to say what the most common is, because it's, all I can sort of reflect on here is, what some of the questions that we have, and that is like, what do you do? How do you do it? Is it prescriptive? Are you going to tell me what it means to be an adolescent or a young man or a young woman, or is it a cult? And when it's not prescriptive, what we do is we create an environment where people are supported to experience, their own talents, their own strengths, through challenging themselves and putting themselves in situations where they learn about themselves. We support people to identify what it is that, that there's that unique essence and those gifts and that spirit of everybody, what that is, and how individuals might connect to that, and how that might be something that can be brought out and contributed in service of others and of a community. Yeah. I think there's potentially, there's some rites of passage experiences that are really destructive and unhealthy. Think of like hazing rituals in colleges, or as teenage years, where they're potentially really destructive and counterproductive to supporting people through these stages of life. And so, yeah, I think there's an element of just separating what we actually do to what some of the misconceptions that people might have based on whatever experience that they have, or whatever it is that they've seen and heard before.
So you kind of have touched on this. How do you communicate what you do to people who don't have the vocabulary to understand it yet, without either oversimplifying it or losing them?
I think we meet people where they're at, and acknowledge that there's changes happening. If you're a parent of a child, that they're growing up, your relationship with them is changing, and what does that entail? And how might we bring a community together of other parents and other kids to support each other in and through those changes? So I think, rather than provide a solution as in terms of this is what you're going to experience as an outcome, what we do is we acknowledge that it's hard being a parent, it's hard being a young person, it's hard being a parent of a young person, it's hard being a young person who feels like they might not be seen or heard or understood, or they don't know what their place in the world is. There's this emerging sort of identity, and how as a, teenager or as an adolescent, how do you navigate that? So we acknowledge that this is the context in which, we're all living. And if you have those questions and you're looking for some guidance and support on how to navigate those, then we provide a space in which that happens in a way that is really well supported. And the
What do
outcome
you wish?
and the outcome, is the outcome is not something we predetermine or is defined. The outcome is something that is emergent.
So what do you wish the mental health field understood about you that it doesn't quite see yet?
What does a mental health? Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question because there's a lot of presumptions that mental health field. I don't know what the mental health field feels or not
Mhm.
believes about what we do. But, I can, I guess my response is that what we do is, I think it's really important foundational preventative work. I think, as I said, we're not a solution, and what we do isn't a fix or a solve for a problem. But what it does is we acknowledge that there are challenges of growing up and becoming and learning and growing through and evolving through different stages of life. How can we support that? What can we do to enable that to be a positive, generative, well supported experience? And that's the work that that's the work that we do. I believe it is preventative, work, and it's not a salve or a solution, and it doesn't exist in isolation. But I do believe that it's really fundamental and really universal in its application. How that looks for different people in different contexts, in different times of their lives or different cultures is going to be different. But yeah, I think it's really important preventative work, and I don't think that's controversial thing to say. I think it's pretty fundamental.
ROPI has worked with the Bachelor people to restore rites of passage on their land, ceremonies that hadn't been practiced for over 200 years. Can you tell me about that relationship? And what does it mean to you to be in proximity to that kind of restoration?
Brisbane, yeah, and yeah, it's just something that I think is testament to the application of this work years. So yeah, I think it's a really really incredible partnership.
So, if you could reach the tens of millions of people who wouldn't voluntarily walk into a traditional support setting, what's the first thing you would want them to understand about what a rite of passage actually is?
I would yes.
Hmm.
What I would be wanting for them is to experience what it feels like to be a part of a community where you belong, where you are seen,
Hmm.
where you are held and supported, where you are in the company of others who are experiencing something similar in different ways, that you're not alone. And I think then the work itself will speak for itself.
So, what would you want people to who hear this conversation to do after listening to it?
Mm. What I would want people to do after listening to this conversation is acknowledge what it is, or if there is anything that resonated and what that was. Is there something that, kind of piqued your curiosity, or is there something that sort of had you wondering or interested, or just to follow that, follow that thread, just to tug on that and see where it leads. And it might be to look at, your own family history or your own context in which you're living, and it might be to that pulling on that thread might be to learn about more about your family's culture, or your own lineage, or it might inspire you to connect with other people in your community who are going through something a similar stage of life with as you, whether you're an adult or a teenager or a elder, whether you're a parent or whether you're going through a redundancy at work or a change in your life situation, maybe to seek others who are going through something similar. But I feel there might be something. I would just encourage people to pull on that thread and see where it leads, and hopefully it will lead to, as I said before, a sense of belonging and a sense of community and a sense of connectedness to others, because I think that's a big part of this work is building a community. So that'd be something I would encourage.
So that was Mikey Ellis, the CEO of the Rites of Passage Institute based in Australia. If you want to see the work up close, the camps, the school programs, the parent-child experiences, you can find more of them at ritesofpassageinstitute.org. And you can also connect with Mikey at his own practice at mikeyellis.com. The Wired Ape is where we learn what it means to live with Stone Age brains in a modern world and why the practices humans have always used to navigate transition, loss, and becoming are not relics. They're still requirements. You can find more at thewiredape.com and through Ritual OS, which will be launching in August 2026.